tonight's lecture, Bonds of War, How Civil War Financial Agents Sold the World on the Union. My name's Paul Quigley. I'm director of the Virginia Center for Civil War Studies, which is based in the History Department at Virginia Tech, and I'm really pleased to welcome you to tonight's event. The center regularly hosts talks like this one, many of them online, some of them in person. And we also sponsor academic conferences and symposia. We give out scholarships and research grants. We do outreach projects in the community. Basically, the idea is to share as much good Civil War era history as we possibly can to as many different audiences as we possibly can. And our next webinar is coming up on December 5th this year. That one's going to be with Dr. Sarah Purcell. The topic is her new book about public funerals in the Civil War era. So if you're interested to learn more about how Americans celebrated, marked the passing of such luminaries as Jefferson Davis and Frederick Douglass and Charles Sumner, this is going to be a great conversation for you on December 5th. And the easiest way to keep up with everything that's going on is by going to our website, which is civilwar.vt.edu. I always have it conveniently for you over my left shoulder in case you forget. You can also find us on Facebook or Twitter or YouTube. And all of our online events, by the way, including tonight's talk, are posted on the center's YouTube channel, so you can catch up with any that you have missed. Okay, tonight's event features the speaker, Dr. David Thompson. He is an associate professor of history at Sacred Heart University in Fairfield, Connecticut. And his research has been sponsored by many organizations, including the Huntington Library, the Rothschild Archive, the Gilder Lehrman Institute, lots of other organizations as well. His work has appeared in some publications you may have heard of, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Boston Globe, among others, and he has spoken widely on his research across the US and Europe as well. And of course, he's the author of a new book, Bonds of War, which is the occasion for tonight's presentation, and he's going to tell us more about the book and what you can learn if you choose to go on and read it. He's going to speak for about 30 to 35 minutes, so we'll have plenty of time for discussion. Our aim is to wrap things up by about 8:15 at the latest Eastern time, so about an hour and 15 minutes from now. And we welcome your feedback, your comments, questions. The way to enter those, to share them with us, is through the Q&A box in Zoom. So hopefully you can see Q&A at the bottom of your screen. You click on that, you can type in your question and submit it. And we may not be able to get to every single question, but we'll certainly try and address as many as we can before we wrap up. So that's all from me for now. I just want to say how grateful I am that Dr. Thompson is able to join us tonight. So let's give him some kind of virtual round of applause and welcome him to our screens. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Paul, and thank you to the center for sponsoring me and enabling me to give this talk. And thank you to you all for spending part of your Tuesday evening here, or whatever time it may be, with me and with everyone else to learn a little bit more about Civil War finance. And I just want to start by saying that, I think this is a really important topic. And of course, you're going to expect that from the guy who just wrote a book on it. But the reason why I say that is it's not just me who thinks it's a really important topic. If you look at newspapers from this time period, the number of articles that focus on finance during the war in the North, the United States, during the conflict is tremendous, right? They're right alongside, reports from the battlefield, kind of political events that are going on in Washington. But right next to that is financial news. And so they thought that this was really important as well back during the Civil War. And so I hope that you take a little bit away from this and certainly have greater appreciation for how the federal government is able to pay for this war. So I'm going to share my screen now and share some slides with you, and we'll properly get started here. And I always like to start with this image here because to me, I see dollar signs when I look at this image, right? We can see obviously there are cannonballs, there are soldiers, there are mortars, there are cannons, there are tents, everything in between. There's a horse in there. If you look closely enough, there are ships. This is all of the different components of war. And it costs money to fight a war. And for the United States government during the American Civil War, it's going to cost to the tune of $3.2 billion with a B. To put that in context today, if we kind of put that into 2022 money, we're talking about 6.7 trillion with a T, $6.7 trillion in total for the federal government and how much they spend on this war. Of that 3.2 billion that I mentioned, about 3/4 of it, a little under 2.23 billion of it, is going to be financed through the sale of bonds, right? So through the sale of effectively government IOUs, right? You give money to the government and they will get it back to you at some point in the future. And in the interim, there are interest payments. And that's a large chunk of how the federal government pays for the Civil War. I'm not going to touch on the Confederacy too much tonight. Aside from in the chat, the Q&A, happy to do so. We can talk a little bit about how the Confederacy actually finances the war. But in terms of the United States government, it's largely going to be through these bond sales. And it's going to be through these distinctive bonds and the distinctive role of these bonds in the 19th century, and crucial actors like a man named Jay Cooke, who we're going to spend some time on, who sells the war kind of far and wide. And this war is going to be sold, if you will, not only to the American people, but it's going to be sold on a global stage as well. Not only is it going to be sold on a global stage and sold to the American people, it's going to be sold to wide swaths of the American people. It's not just going to be wealthy investors, it's going to be everyday citizens, what they call the masses, what they in other articles refer to as the working people. And in these forms of investments, kind of crossing all kind of elements of the spectrum from race and gender, what you see is a confidence in the Union. And in part, the way that Jay Cooke is able to do this is through essentially tying investment to patriotism, and that noting that investment as a patriotic notion is acceptable and is justified during the Civil War. It's okay, in short, to make a little money as long as you're doing it the right way. So you're not a war profiteer, you're not creating shoddy war materials, but rather you're supporting the cause. And in a sense, according to Cooke, it's also a form of sacrifice akin to having a family member serve in the army, for instance, he's going to say at different points. I always love to include this quote, right, from Harper's Weekly, right? When the history of this war comes to be written, no part of it will attract more attention or command more admiration than the chapters which relate to finance. And of course, I get a chuckle out of it because for all the ink that has been spilled when it comes to histories of the American Civil War, there's not a ton on finance during the war. And to me, that's a real shame because finance really tied everyone together in a really intricate web in the 19th century, far more than I think we tend to appreciate, especially when we talk about scholarship in the Civil War era. A unknown Confederate, I will admit it's unknown, allegedly said that the Yankees did not whip us on the field. We were whipped in the Treasury Department. And they said this shortly after the war. And I think it speaks to the importance of this event and the act of investment as a method of success for the Union Army. What you see here in this image is one of the bonds that's issued during the war by the US government. They're going to issue 32 different types of financial instruments during the war. Take a deep breath. I'm not going to go through 32 different financial instruments, I promise. I'm going to talk about 2 different types of bonds tonight that were issued during the war that are really important. But this is one of them. We don't have a lot of them left remaining because they're redeemed by the federal government and they're destroyed. So it's important to kind of be able to see them. I think they evoke lots of imagery from a material culture standpoint. I think that they're also pretty fascinating. All right, so let's talk about finance during the Civil War. And in order to understand that, we have to talk about this gentleman here. This is Secretary of the Treasury, Salmon Chase. Chase does not have a financial background. When he is tapped by Abraham Lincoln to become Secretary of the Treasury, his antebellum experience is in the law. He's actually an anti-slavery lawyer for the most part, based out of Ohio, but part of Lincoln's team of rivals, if you want to view it like that, and kind of referencing Doris Kearns Goodwin. Lincoln's going to bring Chase into his inner circle, and he makes him Secretary of the Treasury. And so there's a pretty steep learning curve for Chase as a result of all of this, unsurprisingly, if you have zero background in finance. And what Chase believes he can do, what he hopes he can do, is treat this war like previous wars that the American government has had to somehow pay for, like the American Revolution, War of 1812, and the Mexican War. And largely those wars were financed to the degree that they were when we talk about bonds through sales to wealthy financiers. These were individuals who were based in cities like New York and Philadelphia, who may then go and sell them to their clients. But by and large, it's the wealthy who are taking on these bonds, particularly the War of 1812 and the Mexican War. That's the model. And so Chase in 1861 is going to go to New York City, and he's going to speak with New York City financiers and try to convince them to invest in the war. And they invest at the beginning, they purchase war bonds, but there's only kind of so far that these investors are willing to go. These are individuals who we have to remember have deep ties to the South from a financial standpoint. So as 1861 progresses and kind of the military prospects for the Union don't look especially great at times, they're hedging their bets a little bit. They're trying to figure out, well, am I really backing the winning horse here? And what happens if someone loses? Am I going to actually see these bonds honored, which is a real question in the 19th century. Question of kind of bond repudiation is alive and well, especially in the United States. Chase threatens the bankers in New York. He says he's willing to print money until it costs $10,000 to have breakfast in the city, which is only going to alarm them even further. And as 1861 progresses, we're going to see things continue to go south to the point that by the end of 1861, we're going to see the suspension of specie payment in the North. In other words, what this means is that you can no longer turn over a paper note to a bank and get the equal amount of gold back from the bank. There's a suspension, and that leads to a pretty significant economic downturn. Chase realizes at this point he's pretty much well out of his depth, and Congress is now going to try to step in as well. Congress is going to pass a Legal Tender Act in February of 1862. And often we talk about the Legal Tender Act and we point to the fact that it's going to produce a currency, right? $150 million of what you see on the screen here, a national currency known as greenbacks. But what the Legal Tender Act also did in February of 1862 was it also authorized a $500 million bond issue, a $500 million bond issue. A 6% bond issue, which is a very high interest rate in the 19th century. It's about twice the interest rate of what you might expect other sovereign states, developed sovereign states, to kind of be floating out there on the open market. And it speaks to really the struggles that the federal government is going to face. Despite the fact that this issue is put forward, Chase continues to struggle. By October of 1862, he can no longer effectively fund the operations of the war, which are increasing in cost. It's going to peak at about $2 million a day in terms of how much it costs to actually fight this war during the late 1864-65 period. So Chase is really up against a wall. He doesn't know what to do, and that's when he calls on a man named Jay Cooke. Jay Cooke, pictured here, is from Ohio, like Chase. They do not know each other, although Chase actually knows Jay Cook's brother, a man named Henry, who's in the newspaper business. So if you're a politician like Chase is, you know the newspaper editors in your state. So he did know Jay Cook's brother. Jay Cook, if anybody knows him out there, probably it's because of his ties to the Panic of 1873 and kind of being the central figure in a global meltdown, certainly in the Western world. But during the Civil War, Jay Cook is a junior banker from Philadelphia. And just before the war, he's going to open his own banking house in Philadelphia, Jay Cook and Company. And it's Jay Cook who's going to turn bond sales around. I had to include this quote because you just can't make it up. Jay Cook, a devoutly religious individual, but also not particularly modest if you're putting yourself up there with the likes of Moses from the Bible. What Jay Cook is going to promote and pitch to Salmon Chase is something that has not been done before widely in the United States, which is a popular loan, meaning selling a bond issue to the masses writ large. If anybody knows anything about war bonds in American history, the associations you probably have are with World War I and World War II, and the Liberty bond drives, Liberty loans, and the various bond drives that helped to finance those wars. Cook is doing that in the 19th century. They actually look at Cook when they start to look for models when it comes to World War I. Cook didn't come up with this, right? And he doesn't pretend to. He's leaning on past practices by the French as well as the Austrians in Europe. He uses them as a model, but he says if you can get kind of communal buy-in, democratic buy-in from the people, you're going to be able to sell more bonds, one, and people are going to be more invested in multiple senses of that word in the success of the war. And so Cook is going to create an army of traveling salesmen. They're going to have state lead agents, and then essentially literally thousands of people who are going to canvass this country to sell bonds to the populace at whole. And again, getting back to what we spoke about right at the beginning, Cook is going to emphasize this idea of the fact that you can profit and it still be a patriotic act because you are supporting the cause of winning the war ultimately and putting your money behind it. It's a bit different from kind of the sense of individual self-sacrifice and asking for donations to the sanitary commission that we might think of for other parts of the war. This is about sacrifice, but you're also kind of pulling in a profit. Cook initially is going to do all of this from a marketing standpoint through his own office, which is based in Philadelphia. This is another one of those bond issues. This is that 520 issue that was part of the Legal Tender Act. Again, it's called a 520 because the government can call in the loan after 5 years, but it matures in 20. And this is actually the source of the cover of my book. It's a beautiful color. That's the color of the book that Paul held up, is the color of the bond. And I just love how much it kind of pops. And you can see kind of at the bottom end of that image, you can see actual coupons. And so what someone would do is they would turn these coupons in order to redeem their interest payment, which was twice a year in May and November. Cook, of course, wants to make these bonds available to the masses. So what do we need to do? Well, we need to make individuals be able to afford them. So they produce bonds in denominations as low as $50. But even then, they know some people don't have $50 at their disposal. So they say, well, we can finance these bonds. And so if you pay over 9 months, you can buy a bond. And so Cook is trying to do everything in his power to really have these bonds reach the masses. It's not just a marketing ploy. He genuinely believes in this. He wants this to reach ultimately millions of people, which he is able to do, by the way. Again, this is his office here in Philadelphia on South 3rd Street, where he's able to kind of make this work. The other thing it's worth noting that's going to lead to some of his success is that Cook is also going to use the power of newspapers. He's going to create fictional interviews where, you know, a farmer is going to write in and say, well, what is a bond? That sounds like something that fancy city folk would actually want, not me as a farmer. And so he creates these kind of fictional back and forths to make bonds appeal to wider swaths of the populace, and that to reinforce this idea that they are indeed supporting kind of the right cause. These advertisements for the bonds are going to be plastered all over different cities and small towns. They also are going to come in different languages, right? We have immigrants that pour into the country in the decades prior to the war and during the war itself, for that matter. So here is a German ad that's going to be placed in Pennsylvania, where you have a heavy German migration. There are Swedish ads for places like Wisconsin that we see, right? Again, all in an effort to try to reach as many people as possible, really trying to meet them where they are, frankly, in order to get them to invest. This is going to change part of the federal government as well. I always like to point this out, and this is an image that I absolutely love. You're going to see the federal government hire hundreds of female clerks who are going to process all of these bond applications, who are going to process interest payments, things like that. And so I certainly wanted to include really this image here as part of kind of that notion of kind of a democratic movement. And we're going to see women be sizable investors in these bonds as well. And so one of the biggest kind of sources that I used for this work were ledger books like this one right here. There are hundreds of them, literally, based at the National Archives at their kind of satellite branch in College Park, Maryland, just outside of Washington, D.C., in the Bureau of Public Debt Records. And these were a goldmine, frankly, and very few people have really used these. I, you know, as a historian and frankly a nerd, I got very excited. I was able to pull shrink wrap off of these things. I asked, well, why are they shrink wrapped? And they said, well, that was when we moved here in 1991. So I figured, okay, so no one's looked at these since at least 1991. And then I pulled the shrink wrap off, and there are little locks on them, and some of them date to the 1880s. So it created kind of chills going up and down my spine, frankly, because of these wonderful ledgers. And you may look at this and just say, well, it's just a list of names, right? But it tells us so much more, particularly when you couple these ledgers with census records. We get a sense of the types of people who are actually buying these bonds. And it really paints a larger picture of the movement. It's not just the marketing, but it's who's actually buying them. And so we see large elements of you know, the immigrant populations of different cities buying these, right? So if we use Chicago as an example, Maria Martin is an Irish immigrant who purchased $100 worth of bonds. Mary Heim is from the German states. Germany doesn't exist as a country yet. Catherine Siebold, also from the German states. Alexander Dienst, another immigrant. You know, I can go on and on. We have all sorts of individuals that come from all walks of life, from teachers to those that run boarding houses, to bricklayers, to lawyers and doctors who are investing in the Civil War and purchasing these bonds. Not only do we see these kind of different investors on that scale as individuals, we also see institutional investors. And I don't just mean banks. I'm also talking about institutions of higher education, colleges and universities, right? So Oberlin buys bonds, Columbia, Yale, Harvard, they're all purchasing these bonds. And even archives, I got a chuckle, right? So the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, which is still in existence today, where Jay Cook's papers are housed, that institution in 1863 purchased bonds. So I could actually say to them while I was researching there, you know, you bought Civil War bonds once upon a time. And you know, it's just really interesting to see the different types of groups that purchase these bonds. Pacifist societies, you know, that they're willing to invest in the war. And it becomes a who's who as well. You know, celebrities of the time are going to purchase these bonds. Businesses like Brooks Brothers, right, still around today, purchase these bonds. Abraham Lincoln purchases bonds, as well as dozens of members of Congress, all coming kind of out of these ledgers. And what this map shows you, and it's not perfect, I acknowledge that, because what we're looking at here is, you know, a map of modern borders, but it shows where people were from who purchased these bonds. And it's not perfect. You know, certainly there were investors from Canada who lived in the United States and purchased them. I just don't have definitive proof of it, so I didn't want to include it here. But Cook is going to meet with wild success with this 520 issue. He's actually going to oversubscribe the issue by $14 million. And it's going to lead to him being brought in ultimately for a second bond issue, which I just want to briefly mention. It's known as the 730 issue. And not to confuse everyone, but they're called 730s because they have a 7.3% interest rate. It was an $800 million issue that Cook is going to put in place. And again, we have additional ledgers. This one's from Brunswick, Maine, on, you know, not terribly far from where I am in Connecticut, and a small college town where Bowdoin College, you know, Joshua Chamberlain and others go to. They have a sizable amount of investors. The 730 is the largest issue at 800 million. And it's going to be one that Cook is going to sell in record time after the federal government struggles to get it off the ground when they try to cut him out initially and then bring him back. It's sold not only in the north, it's sold out west. Wells Fargo is a new bank at this time, and it sells these bonds out west in California and Oregon and parts of what becomes New Mexico. And they sell these in the Confederacy too, right? That's one way to demonstrate your loyalty to a new occupier, if you want to look at it that way, is to buy bonds, right? So cities like New Orleans become areas with large bond sales. Then they also sell them in large quantities to soldiers. And they're also used to pay soldiers when there's a cash flow issue, right? To get them their payment at $13 a month if we're talking about a private. They also create very creative ways to reach people. They call them night offices in this one instance, right? This is an ad for these night offices with a list of locations in New York City and surrounding areas in New Jersey, where you get free coffee and donuts, and all you have to do is sit there and listen to a bond pitch. It's a little bit like someone trying to sell you a timeshare, right? But again, if you want to reach the working men and women, as it says in this ad, you need to be able to work at their hours, and you need to make it convenient for them. And so Cook is going to stay in through the duration of the war, and he's going to go to New York after Lincoln's assassination to study those markets. And so he plays a tremendous role when it comes to that domestic side of the campaign. But the domestic side is only one side of the actual campaign. I just want to spend a couple minutes here at the end. I'm very cognizant of the time, but I do want to spend a couple minutes talking about the international side of this, because these bonds also sold internationally. And this right here is a letter. This is from a Dutch bank to a British bank, talking about the market for US bonds in 1863, in the middle of the war. And I think if we don't talk about the international side of it, you miss the full picture, because international sales were so vital to the legitimacy of the United States government. Obviously, the Confederacy tries to sell bonds abroad as well, and I can get into that in the Q&A if somebody wants to hear more about that. But the U.S. government desperately wanted, to keep international support, particularly European support, on their side. And they wanted to do that in a variety of ways, one of which was through selling bonds abroad. Britain, of course, is the largest market at this time. London is the financial capital of the Western world, but they're reticent to buy these bonds. And again, it speaks to this kind of conflict of interest, if you will, when you've got British financiers with deep connections and ties to the Cotton South, where they rely on a lot of their business and their money is deposited. And so there are some sales during the war in London. This is a ledger book that still survives to this day. It's in London for a bank, a British bank, George Peabody and Company. I am cheating a little bit, though, because George Peabody is actually an American who lives in London. If you go there today, this is a statue that still exists in his honor, because he provided a lot of philanthropic support to the kind of the poorer elements of London. If we really want to talk about where the sales actually occurred during the war. It's not in London, but it's in cities like Frankfurt and Amsterdam, the German states, the kind of the precursor to Germany and the Netherlands. And the reason why Frankfurt really becomes ground zero is because of really two factors: familial ties across the Atlantic, where families have banking operations on both sides, as well as kind of what I call in the book faith-based networks. Jewish bankers working with other Jewish bankers and Christian bankers working with other Christian bankers. But it's particularly the Jewish banking network in Frankfurt and their ties to banks in New York City, which is so pivotal. I love this poster. It's depicting bankers from the Seligman family who are in Frankfurt trying to sell US bonds. They're actually based out of New York, although they're originally from Germany. But by the time of the war, they live in the US, and they come over and they're trying to convince people at the Frankfurt Stock Exchange to buy these bonds. And they meet with remarkable success. And we don't have the Jewish banking records because of World War II. Many of them were destroyed by the Nazis. And so unfortunately, we don't have these surviving ledgers. But what we can point to is other areas and other records that also give us an indication of the vibrancy of the bond market in Germany. I apologize for the quality of the image here. This is a photo of microfilm because they wouldn't let me look at the originals. But this is the one of many letters written by the US consular officer based in Frankfurt, a man named William Walton Murphy during the Civil War, who writes multiple times a day to Secretary of State Seward, in which he reports over and over about the vibrancy of the bond market in Frankfurt and everything he's doing to sell bonds abroad. He has huge parties, frankly, at his residence in Frankfurt. He sponsors events outside of the city, shooting festivals, music festivals, and they all have that ulterior motive of trying to convince people to buy bonds, right? So give people free food, maybe give them some free booze, and convince them in part to buy these bonds. But Murphy doesn't have to do a ton of work at times because of this tie that some folks feel to the United States. And some of it is a tie that is because of familial ties. I mentioned the banks, but also there's an element of families seeing loved ones go to the United States and then getting letters sent back to them saying, you should buy these bonds. It's a form of investment. It tied you to the United States, and maybe you want to move there. And so that would literally tie you as a prospective immigrant as well. So we see that really start to play out. The other thing that we can also point to as revealing kind of the vibrancy of this market is the fact that US bonds are quoted on German stock exchanges, and we have those records available, but the market is so active that they actually have multiple quotations a day. So if back in the 19th century, if a bond was particularly active, you would have a midday quotation and an end of day quotation in terms of the value, right? Not the ticker that we think of today with kind of live updates more or less. But US bonds were actually given midday quotations. And that's a rarity for bonds from outside the German states and say Austria, for them to be quoted in Berlin and Frankfurt and Munich and Hamburg and other places with a midday quotation. It reveals a vibrancy in that market that is unparalleled. Austria bans the sale of these bonds in its borders. It refers to US bonds as the most dangerous of all assets. And the reason why they call them that is because they're dangerous to the Austrian economy, because people are dropping Austrian bonds and selling them and dropping the value of that stock, if we want to look at it that way, and purchasing American bonds. We do have a couple of bank records that survive from places like Germany. This is one Christian bank in Frankfurt, Bethmann Bank House. And these records are in Frankfurt. You can see this little box. It says 6%, 1882 Amerikaner on there. Those are those 520 bonds that I was talking about, which are the most popular bonds that are sold abroad. So how many of these bonds are sold during the war abroad? Estimates put it at about 320 million. Of that, 250 million is located in the German states and the Netherlands. I think those numbers are low. I think they're a bit higher based on some of the work that I've done. But the German states and the Netherlands are by far kind of the most vibrant markets. They're not the only ones, though. This is a record for a Dutch bank. I do just want to at least show you one from Hope & Company, which is a very prominent firm in Amsterdam during the war. And then this is actually a ledger book for a bank in Switzerland. So it's not just kind of established markets, it's emerging markets like Switzerland, right? So Switzerland and finance are kind of synonymous in the 21st century. But in the 1860s, Switzerland's just kind of getting their financial feet underneath them, particularly in foreign investment or investment beyond, say, France. And so this is for one bank. This is a ledger. Might be a little hard to read, and it's in French, but it's speaking to American investment on the part of this bank, purchasing these bonds in Frankfurt as well as in New York, and they're purchasing from family members. So we talk about this idea of familial connections. Once again, you start to see them here. I neglected to mention with the German states, there's a heavy anti-aristocratic sentiment as well that leads to their support of the Union, because they associate aristocracy with the Confederacy. It's kind of a holdover from the Revolution of 1848, and that really almost upended the German states entirely. I'm just, for the sake of time, going to skip ahead a couple slides here to this one heat map to show you for that Bethmann Bank that I was just referencing. This is where their clients are based. So you can see, while the bank is based in Frankfurt, their clients are all over, right? And it stretches all the way to the Black Sea in modern day Ukraine, as well as to Paris and even in London, although I cut it off here, all right? And so these investments only skyrocket even further after the war ends, reaching the point that within 5 years of the end of the Civil War, half of the US national debt, half of that debt is found in Europe. It's about $1 billion by 1869 into 1870. And so if I show you another one of these maps, again, this is where I have definitive proof of residents of these countries purchasing bonds, right? And so it literally stretches the globe by 1870. Places like Japan, you can see they actually have to create specific bonds for Japan, written in Japanese. You can see places like South Africa. There's investment. Parts of South America see heavy investment as well. Cuba becomes a sizable investor to the tune of about $150 million. So these bonds are going to be sold across the globe. And I want to end with this image here. This is a newspaper article from World War I, December 1917, right? And it says how Jay Cooke made the people want to buy bonds during the Civil War. And you can see those night offices on the far right-hand side of the image that I had a zoomed in version of earlier. But the article is about how Jay Cooke is the model for how they are going to sell popular loan issues during World War I. They actually use Jay Cooke's grandson as kind of the lead person in Philadelphia, really to be the person who is out there kind of from the publicity front. And so this is the story of, Civil War finance. On a very basic level, of course, it is how they pay for the Civil War when it comes to the United States government, a war that costs more than $2 million a day by its end. You have to somehow pay for it, and bonds is one way of paying for it. But it's deeper than that, right? That this is really, in effect, showing a kind of a new economic order that's moving in. This is a critical moment where we see investment banking start to take off in the United States. And it gives us a window into where we see American finance by the turn of the century and the early 20th century, with kind of popular investing, right? And the repercussions of that as more and more people get involved in the stock market. I'm not saying the Civil War and Civil War finance causes that. I'm saying that this is kind of one area that you can point to as the beginning of kind of a longer narrative and an evolution. because this really opens a new chapter in American financial history. And it's one in which we see this debt being extended not only to the American populace, to millions of Americans buying this debt, but also a global community. So I thank you for your time, and I look forward to answering as many questions as I can.
Well, thank you very much indeed. Even as
Yeah.
someone who's read the book, that was really interesting. And I love how clearly you laid everything out there. So thank you. You mentioned a couple of times that you would be willing, if asked, to talk about the Confederate side of things. And sure enough, we've got a couple of people out there interested in that side of things. So how did the Confederacy finance the war? What was the role of bonds there? How successful were they? That kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think one of the ways to kind of think about this is that the Confederacy is kind of the inverse of the federal government, right? So if the federal government, it's probably like 70% of the US government funding of the war is through bonds. It's 70%, maybe a little less, of the Confederate effort is going to be funded, so the majority of it, through just printing money. Right. So the Confederacy, we often talk about inflation in the Confederacy, in terms of wartime inflation, it's second only to the American Revolution. And so that's how the Confederacy, in short, largely finances it. When it comes to bonds, the Confederacy is going to finance about a third of the war through bonds, and then very little through things like taxes and tariffs, because an income tax, for instance, in the Confederacy is kind of a non-starter, trying to convince people to actually front that. So it's slightly different. The one thing I will point out when it comes to the Confederacy on the bond front is they are actually successful doing something that the United States government is not, which is the Confederacy actually places a loan in Europe, right? That they actually get a bank to underwrite. So all of these bond sales that I was talking about for the federal government, they're all on the secondary market, right? So somebody bought this from the federal government and then they're selling it again. The Confederacy gets a French bank, Erlanger, to a Parisian bank to finance a cotton loan, the Erlanger loan, that's going to be essentially the interest paid out in cotton. Little bit of kind of drama behind it, because the whole reason why it happens is that the daughter of this Parisian banker is marrying the Confederate ambassador to Paris. So he's doing his future son-in-law a favor, I think, to a certain degree. But they are successful, right? And that is another kind of feather in the Confederacy's cap, where they say, look, we're international players, right? We're getting an international loan. The federal government doesn't get that. And they never do. They try very hard, and they're very close on a couple of occasions, but no bank is willing to make that level of commitment of underwriting a loan during the war itself.
Well, thank you. And kind of following on from there, were there any attempts by the Confederates to sabotage Union bond sales and marketing, whether in Europe or anywhere else?
Absolutely. So that's a great question. And the answer is yes, in kind of both areas. When it comes to the kind of the international side, there are very clear examples of producing counterfeit bonds, right? Counterfeit money is very common during this time period. Counterfeit bonds are a little bit harder to do for a variety of reasons, and they're not as common. But that doesn't mean they don't try. And so there's a report that comes in from a US ambassador, a consular officer in Brussels, that says he's heard of Confederates working in Ireland to send counterfeit bonds to France, right? So there's a lot of moving parts there, right? But there are efforts to sabotage this movement. In the Confederacy itself, and kind of, closer to home, the efforts really center around kind of a misinformation campaign, right? So as Union forces move into the Confederacy and there are reports of bond sales, Confederate newspapers say, these bonds are no good. They're sold by this guy, Jay Cooke, who can't be trusted. It's rather funny. They never spell Jay Cooke's name right. It's always with an E at the end of J. and Cook without the E. They misplace an E somewhere frequently. So it's mostly kind of that misinformation, but kind of producing the counterfeit bonds are just less common, at least from what I came across. And there aren't really reports that the Treasury Department is really concerned about that, right? They're far more concerned about things like counterfeit money.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned, maybe some suspicion about Jay Cook and his trustworthiness. We've got a couple of questions, and I love how two different viewers asked a similar kind of question in different ways. One asked the simple question, what was Jay Cook's markup on this whole thing? And then the other says, Cook's patriotism is all well and good, but are Cook or individuals like him skimming off the top? Is there federal government oversight? Is that effective?
Yeah. So, if this was slightly longer, I didn't mean to make it a worship session, fanboying here for Jay Cook. But the short answer is, in terms of kind of a commission, it's not huge if we think about it. It changes from issue to issue, so it's not a flat rate throughout the whole thing. Let's use the 520 loan as an example. He gets 3/8 of 1% is his commission, but Cook has to cover all marketing costs. So you need to figure out, it's 3/8 of 1%. A third of that goes to these traveling agents, and then you also have to cover marketing. So he's not making a whole bunch of money off of this. He really isn't. Now, I will be honest with you, what he is thinking is, this is putting me on the map for after the war. I can be the America's banker, right? I can be the man who stood by during difficult times. There's a series of congressional investigations into Cook, right? Cook buys, rather famously, Chase a carriage, a horse-drawn carriage. And it's viewed as, he's bribing him to get future contracts. And Chase has to give it back, but then says, actually, just give it to my daughter as a wedding present, and then that's okay. And so, Cook is, a pretty vocal Republican as the war progresses. And so Democrats in the Congress, but also Democrats on Wall Street, and there's a lot of them, do not care for him. And so there's some partisanship at play. There's never any, these investigations never really go anywhere. He's not, all it leads to is, for instance, the 730 issue. It just delays his inevitable kind of appointment to it. But so he does make some money off the war. It's hard to know exactly the number, but it's not, this isn't what's going to set him up to be wildly successful, which he is by the late 1860s, early 1870s, only to lose it all with the Panic of 1873.
So there is some element of patriotism in his motivations there, probably.
There's some element there of that. And his brother, I think, is the one that really knocks it into him, frankly, Henry, who is, as I said, a newspaper editor. He moves to Washington, D.C. to essentially be the political guy. So he's the one who is going to Capitol Hill. He's meeting with members of Congress. He's hearing the latest news on future bond issues and things like that. He had an office that no longer exists today. It's really on the grounds of the White House today, frankly, was where it existed. And but he's pulling a lot of levers behind the scenes. One other thing I will mention about Jay Cook, where he might be making some money, and this is where his brother does come in, is Cook was supposed to, conduct these bond sales and then turn the money over to the federal government in short order, but there wasn't like a specific timeline. And so there's more than one letter from his brother that essentially boils down to, hey, you owe the federal government $14 million. And it was supposed to be here like a week ago or two, and they're getting anxious. And, reading between the lines, it looks like Cook is taking this money, going to New York with it, spinning it that way, right? So I guess what I should clarify is, he's not making money directly off the bonds, but he's using this as his own little private kitty to then go and invest in railroads, even in bonds on Wall Street, and sell them.
That's very interesting. So there was a little bit extra.
A little bit extra. Sorry, I neglected to mention that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, that's very interesting. Question about the post-war period and whether the American public was invested in the debt after the war in patriotic terms. So did the idea that buying US bonds was a sign of loyalty continue into the Reconstruction period? And was it, or did it affect the construction of the 14th Amendment, the clause upholding the validity of the public debt, and how else might it have affected Reconstruction politics? So you've got a lot to chew on there.
In 30 seconds, right? Go. The short answer for the first part of that is that bond sales after the war fall off a cliff, right? So the federal government at this point, we have to keep in mind, bond sales really are only during exceptional times. Prior to the war, there's public land sales, there's tariffs, right? The federal government is tiny, so its expenditures are rather minimal. So it doesn't need to issue bonds annually at times, or certainly not large issuance. And so after the war, what's going to happen is the federal government is going to scale down its bond sales. It's going to refinance all that Civil War debt because it's at a really high interest rate, and it's going to get it to drop lower. I often get asked, for instance, when does the federal government pay off the debt from the Civil War? And that's a really tricky question because they refinance it, several times over. So probably like the 1890s, but it's hard to say. It's not like those bonds are the same ones from the Civil War itself. And so there's that element that we have to be mindful of, that those bond sales kind of go away. And what a lot of people will end up doing is they start to shift what money they do have into savings accounts, right? Which had started right before the war. Those had really started to take off as something that they called them working man's savings accounts. This idea that you work for a wage now, and if you've got a little bit on the side, you can invest, put it in a bank and tuck it away for a rainy day. 1873 is going to, scupper a lot of people's savings, and so it's going to disappear. In terms of that 14th Amendment question, yeah, I mean, I think that it's a big part of it here, that it not only is it honoring the federal debt, we're not honoring Confederate debt, right, with the 14th Amendment. And so it's a huge part of the conversation. This post-war period, during Reconstruction, one of the biggest battles in Washington is over that question of debt. And certainly those who have read up on Reconstruction would know that like, if you actually read through the Congressional Globe and read these debates, they're talking a lot about this question of war debt. And this is something that Grant is particularly keen on, having obviously fought the war himself, that this debt be honored, and that it not go away. And it becomes a very tremendously huge partisan issue, one that Cook will wade into occasionally, but he's often viewed as kind of a boogeyman. So at times he's told to kind of exit stage right. You're not helping when you produce, op-eds and things like that.
Yeah. So by the way, please, attendees, please keep the questions coming in. We've had some great ones so far. One of the themes I really enjoyed about the book were the connections you draw between the financial sphere and battlefield events. So going in both directions, these two spheres are really influencing one another. And this may be a kind of chicken and egg situation, but I was wondering whether you thought that the battlefield successes of the Union were responsible for the ultimate success of the bonds in financing the war, or were the bonds finances more responsible for those battlefield successes?
I think it's more the former, right? So the first of those, and there's been some scholarship to look at this, right, and kind of tracking the value of these bonds on the secondary market, because they do, trade at a premium, right? So $100 bond at its peak during the Civil War is going to cost you something like $116. And so they're trading for more than their face value, and but it's certainly going to be aided and by these performances on the battlefield, I guess we could say, battlefield results. And that's not just true in the United States, that's also true in Europe, right? And of course, you have to remember we've got a 3-week, give or take, lag time to get those results across the Atlantic, because there's no transatlantic cable during the war. It broke just before the war, so it's not replaced until after the war. So it takes 3 weeks, but there are all these reports. There's a famous, I mentioned it in the book, but there's a moment in, I believe it's Berlin, where in February of '65, on Washington's birthday, there are all these false reports that that the war is over, right? They're picking up on the 13th Amendment, but there's this sense that slavery has finally ended and it's Washington's birthday. And so people start, these reports, and you have to take some of it with a grain of salt, right? That people are waving American flags around, and I'm wondering, where are they getting these American flags, if that's indeed the case. But it is based on what they're hearing from across the Atlantic, sometimes not tied to, actual, defeats or victories on the battlefield, but, political fighting as well, and what's happening in Washington.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
We have one viewer who's interested in the point you made earlier about the alleged Confederate counterfeiters in Ireland. And this viewer is wondering whether they can find out more in your book or maybe somewhere else about that story.
Yeah. Yes. There's a little bit, there's at least a citation of where I got it. I'm blanking on it right now. But there also would probably be a few newspaper articles about it as well. So in the book itself, it'd give you at least the rough date, which again, I'm just not, it's not coming to mind. But yeah, there's a little bit more. But if they want to go digging and they can find some more stuff, have at it, because it's fascinating to read, particularly European newspapers at the time. Some of them, there are ads for missing bonds as well. So people will say, my bond was supposed to be physically shipped across the Atlantic and it never got to me. So if you see this bond number somewhere, can you please bring it to such and such address, or send it to such and such address, and I'll cover the postage. Because for most of the war, they actually physically transport the bonds across the Atlantic, because some people want to have them in their possession, or they want their bank in London or their bank in Amsterdam to have that bond in their possession. So there's crooked treasury agents as well. Eventually they have to give them essentially a chest of bonds, but they're not given the key for their own chest so they have to get across the Atlantic, and then they swap keys. So yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask you another question about very, very specific detail in your book. And I enjoyed the big themes and the big picture and the really significant arguments you make in the book. There was one tiny detail that, for whatever reason, stuck in my mind. And it's just a couple of lines where you talk about the one guy, I forget his name, who had to personally sign all of the bonds at one point. And how did that even work? And did that continue for most of the war, or how did that?
So the register of the treasury, right? This was his job. And so in the antebellum period, this is one of several tasks that this person is supposed to do, but they do physically sign bonds. During the war, it becomes a full-time job, and more than a full-time job. They actually have to bring on an additional, really, 2 people to sign bonds, and they're signing in this person's name. They find some legal justification for how they could do it. But at its peak during the war, what you'd see when you look at these ledgers, right, because it'll say kind of date of sale, date of delivery for some of these bonds, and it can take up to 2 weeks from when someone is actually physically handing over money to when they get it. And kind of, we're talking about supply chains, right? Like the biggest part of it, it's not that they're not printing enough bonds or something like that. It's not that element that's holding up the process. It's that this poor person has to, sign these bonds, and, I can only imagine their hand was falling off. at some point. So it's not until the post-war period that you start to they change that. But it's an exceptional time, right, in terms of the volume of bonds that they just haven't been nearly anywhere close to that prior to that in the 19th century for the United States government. This is on a whole other level in terms of financing. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. No, I had to read it over several times to make sure that I was reading it correctly. And it was, and there's a few letters this person's pleading, right? I need more support. Like I'm working all hours of the day effectively. And I just envision this person like at their desk in the stack, right? They just keep bringing more and more of them out, and it just keeps growing. And, there's no way of getting out from underneath that. So I'm now a department chair. So I kind of see that. I get that feeling sometimes with its emails, but it's the same basic idea. So, yeah.
I can only imagine.
Yeah.
One of the students here at Virginia Tech congratulates you on covering a really interesting topic here, and is, I think, wondering whether you could recommend additional areas of the financial history of the Civil War that could be worthy of more attention, maybe a possible research topic for students.
Yeah, for sure. So when it comes to the Confederacy, I didn't mention this before, it's the evidence, right, or lack thereof, that these treasury records just don't exist for the most part. So it becomes a bit more of a struggle to kind of make that work. But one thing I would love to see, if I had to pick one area, just to be selfish here, if somebody could actually look at it from during the Civil War itself, is to have somebody really look into the US government and its purchase of cotton during the Civil War. So there are all these cotton agents, and they kind of are in the periphery of the reports that I'm reading, right? But eventually there are treasury agents, and their job is to go into the South and buy cotton. And it comes up in some of my work because I'm reading reports from treasury agents where people are, you name it, they're demanding that they be paid in bonds, or they be not paid in bonds, right? And they're only being offered bonds. But that's something that it's a large operation, and it only gets larger as the war progresses. But it's something that I wish there'd be more written on, because I think it's an area ripe for exploration, because between the treasury records, and even some of the military records and the ORs, that there's some material in there as well, because there's issues around safety for these agents and diverting resources to have, an armed escort and things like that. So that's something I'd love to see more on personally, because and as far as I know, no one's working on it. So
wonderful.
It could be fun.
Yeah, sounds like a great suggestion. Thank you.
Yeah.
So when the bonds were given to Union soldiers as part of their pay, was that a common occurrence, or just every now and again? Was it just when cash was scarce, or how did that work?
Yeah, it was largely this is the emergency, we're breaking the glass occurrence towards, and at different points, right? So I think, there's a lot of scholarship, of course, on soldiers being paid and notoriously being kind of months behind. So the paymaster, they eventually get around to you, and you've got 4, 5, 6 months of back pay that they eventually need to funnel your way. And what had happened was some of these traveling salesmen were just following the armies around and realized that they could actually sell them. And word of this got back to the treasury. And they said, well, if the soldiers want these so badly, why don't we just skip that middle part and just pay them in bonds? Some of them do not like it. It's a more common occurrence in the Western theater, from what I can tell, than in the East. But it's something that some of them are totally on board with and totally fine with. Others are very angry. And they're rather public about it. And so sometimes those letters even show up like in Jay Cook's papers, because he gets letters from all sorts of people.
Right.
And he kept everything, which I'm grateful for, of course, but it includes things like that, where people are like, I don't want this. And I blame you, because I hear your name everywhere. So I'm writing you, so fix it, essentially. is kind of how they look at it.
I'm willing to bet he didn't really do anything to fix that, did
No,
he?
I think that letter just kind of fell by the wayside.
Right.
So, yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
Question about the Europeans buying the bonds and whether you've got any examples of notable Europeans, like one viewer is wondering about Bismarck, for example. You know, are there people like that who are buying them?
So that's a great example because Bismarck does buy them. Yeah. Bismarck is probably the most high profile individual. There are all sorts of, you know, landed gentry, shall we say, in some of parts of continental Europe. So I'm sure their names may have been famous at the time, and they've got royal titles and things like that. But by far the most high profile individual is going to be Bismarck. There's some very high profile people in Britain who buy Confederate bonds. And this becomes public. There's a huge kind of expose in December of 1865 in the Times in London newspaper, where they just put out a list, right, of all these people who bought Confederate bonds. And it includes people like Colonel Fremantle from the movie Gettysburg, who we all probably remember. He buys them. Lots of other, but members of parliament buy them, who allegedly, and some rather publicly, were kind of saying, I'm neutral, and there's these records, right? So it leads to kind of, for the time period, a bit of a political scandal when it comes to members of parliament. So, yeah.
Absolutely. So I'm just gonna, we've got time for a few more questions, but I'm going to paste into the chat a link to the UNC press page for the book, just in case anybody wants to click on that. So they've got the page up there if they want to learn more about the book. But we do have time for a few more questions. And one of them is going back a bit to the Confederacy again, and is a really interesting question, I think, about how the Confederacy dealt with the transition from being part of the Union with the Union economy, Union currency, to setting up its own national economy and currency. Like, that sounds like a massive undertaking. How did they manage it?
It's a great question, and they don't handle it well, right? Although, you know, to be fair, it is a monumental undertaking when you're literally trying to create a government from scratch, essentially. And certainly a big challenge is creating an economic system and types of currency, and you're building a government based on the premises of a supremacy of states, right? Compared to kind of a federal national structure. So how does that work? And the Secretary of the Treasury at the beginning of the war, Christopher Memminger of the Confederacy, has a Herculean task. And it's a bit of a challenge. Now, ultimately, states, of course, are going to produce all sorts of their own currency, which creates huge questions around exchange rates. And that becomes a rather, you know, thorny and you know, difficult issue. But it's a struggle. It's a tremendous struggle that they never really are fully able to put their hands around. They realize cotton can be, you know, a weapon, if you will, a resource financially. And so sometimes people start to pay and purchase bonds in cotton as opposed to things like specie, but then they become specie poor in the Confederacy. So they don't have enough gold, but they, you know, everybody's got cotton and they're handing cotton over the, you know, Confederacy. And as the blockade strengthens, they're like, what do we do with all this cotton? And that's where those cotton agents from the US government kind of come in from time to time, because there's just a surplus of cotton that's going to emerge. So Memminger, you know, he doesn't make it through the whole war. And part of it, I think, is just out of frustration, because I don't know if he really had the support that he needed in Richmond. Truth be told, that he said, you know, I need these things to happen. And there was only so much that Davis's administration was really willing to do, and to some degree could do. And it leads to tremendous difficulties. And then obviously the rampant inflation that we talked about.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, huge problem for the Confederacy there.
Yeah. And it leads to, you know, one Virginia example I can give. One of my favorite letters from the entire war that is sent to Cook came like 10 days after Appomattox from Petersburg. And it's 3 individuals who want to start a bank in Petersburg and they want to sell Union bonds. And they ask, is it going to be problematic that we were all just paroled from Appomattox? Like, just full disclosure, right? This just happened to us, but we're good people. So, and we want to sell the bonds. So I think there's this recognition that, they want to get back into that structure as quickly as possible. And for parts of the occupied South, places like New Orleans that have been occupied for a very long time, they've been using greenbacks for a very long time. They've also been paying taxes. That's also, the IRS is created during the war, and the IRS is collecting taxes in New Orleans 9 days after Union forces take control of the city. So the tax man is there right at the very beginning, it would seem.
Yeah. One person is asking what happened with the Confederate bonds. Presumably they just are worthless and don't get paid at all at the end of the war.
Yeah, there's a couple of states that try to create incentives. I want to say Arkansas is one of them, to try and bring them in, and you can get kind of partial money for them. But yeah, they're largely worthless right after the fight over including them in the 14th Amendment and or having them included just as part of, honoring of debt. Now you can buy them on eBay, right? And people, so if anybody wants one, they're out there. They're largely, it's like any failed state, if we look at it that way. They just they exist, but they're just a piece of paper.
I can't resist asking, what about the lost Confederate gold that people sometimes talk about?
Oh, God.
There are various legends.
Yes,
Does that fall within the purview of your research or not so much?
Nothing that I came across, but I can't say that it's not, it is indeed possible, I'm sure. But nothing that I saw.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
And then one of the big themes, really important and interesting themes of the book for me, was the democratization of investing and the fact that it was more inclusive, more people from, different walks of life could buy these bonds. But then I'm also thinking, it wasn't an insignificant amount if it's like a $100 bond in 1864 or something. So do you have any sense of like how far down the ranks of society this went? I don't know how you'd even answer that. It's impossible to quantify, but
I mean, the short answer is that there's millions of people who buy these things. So John Sherman, future Secretary of the Treasury, Senator from Ohio, really good friends with the Cooks, especially Henry Cook, during the war is quoting like 2 million people. And that's like in 1864. And there's way more. So even with repeat, buyers, it's more, I think, and when you look at some of the occupations that are listed in the census, right, there are definitely some individuals who we would consider working class, right? If we want to use that term, blue collar workers, they're in there, right? They're not the most common investor, but they're in there and they're purchasing a $50 bond. So, they're there. It's not just a war. And that was partly what fascinated me so much about this. The more I got into it, is it's not just elites buying these things. It's not a marketing campaign that failed miserably. They actually successfully sell these things to some folks kind of across the socioeconomic spectrum, really for the first time in US history. And in doing so, as I've said, they kind of set up a blueprint for future investing and structures for approaching future war bonds and financing of American wars in the 20th century.
Great. Well, with that statement of some of the major ideas of your book and really significant ideas for Civil War era history, I think we should draw things to a close. But I want to thank you so very much for sharing your expertise with us this evening. It's been a wonderful presentation, great answers to the questions. I also want to thank the audience for the questions, for being with us tonight and giving us so much good stuff to talk about. I'd also like to thank donors to the Virginia Center for Civil War Studies. They make everything we do possible, and I'm really grateful to them for their support. Dave Thompson. His book is Bonds of War. I encourage you all to go out and buy it and learn even more than you learned over the last hour or so about the finances of the Union during the Civil War. Just a quick reminder, our next online event is December 5th, Sarah Purcell on public funerals of the Civil War era. And if you want to register for that one, you can go to civilwar.vt.edu and follow the links to the events listing. With that, thanks once again to Professor Thompson. We really appreciate your talk tonight. Thank you.
Thank
Good
you,
night.
Paul. Thank you.